Hello! Magandang umaga po sa lahat. Welcome to the July 2022 edition of the UP SLIS webinar series organized by the UP School of Library and Information Studies. Welcome po sa mga students, teachers of Library and Information Science, information professionals, and all our friends in the Philippines and around the world. I'm Paul Jason Perez, a faculty member from UP SLIS, your host and moderator for today. This webinar is in high definition or HD, so for an optimal viewing experience and to ensure that you can read the text in the presentation slides, please check and adjust the settings of this live stream to HD. Right now, you may also check the audio and adjust the volume to a comfortable listening level. You can also watch this webinar live on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page, UPSLIS. You can also watch at our official channel on Twitch TV, that's twitch.tv/UPSLIS. This webinar is still part of our hashtag Webinar Wednesdays that we started 2 years ago, July of 2020. The webinars are part of our celebration of the 60th anniversary of UPSLIS. And just a few days ago, the 61st anniversary of UPSLIS. So before we continue, let me explain the mechanics for today's webinar. To all our viewers, if you have any questions, you can send them anytime during the webinar. To post your questions, please go to slido.com. That's www.slido or slido.com and type in the code troll or hashtag TROLL. That's troll. Again, that's slido.com with code troll. We will not entertain questions posted in the chat or the comment section. Again, please post your question by going to slido.com and typing in the code troll. We will also show the website and the QR code on the screen throughout the talk. We would also love to hear your thoughts about today's webinar, so please watch out for the announcement containing the link for the webinar's evaluation. In the evaluation form, you can also suggest future topics that you would like us to discuss. You may also request for certificates of participation through our evaluation link. If in case you miss portions of this webinar, you may view this as a Facebook video or check our YouTube and Twitch channels. Okay, so that's for the mechanics. Let's get things moving. As I mentioned earlier, we've just celebrated our 61st anniversary, and for that, we have a short message from our OIC Dean Assistant Professor Rhea Rowena U. Apolinario.
A pleasant day, everyone. This month, we are celebrating the University of the Philippines School of Library and Information Studies 61st anniversary with the theme UPSLIS at 61, Ad Astra. Ad Astra is Latin for to the stars. We are truly shooting for the stars. We are relentlessly pursuing developments in all aspects, teaching, research, and extension services, while at the same time bridging information, technology, and society. We are grateful to all our students, faculty, staff, alumni, and partners who have worked together and are continuously working together to bring UPSLIS to new heights. There is much to do and much more to achieve. From the school's humble beginning in 1961, when it was established as a separate degree granting unit at the University of the Philippines, the school remained to be steadfast and committed in improving the LIS education in the country. We honor those who came before us, the pillars of library science and library and information science, who had the vision and foresight to act towards the advancement of the profession. Looking back, UPSLIS year-long celebration of its 60th anniversary with the theme Challenging Traditions, Embracing Innovations was marked with notable achievements. Such achievements were the approval of the University of the Philippines Diliman of the Master of Science in Library and Information Science and the first formal graduate training in Archives and Records Management in Southeast Asia, the Master in Archives and Records Management program. These new programs will now be offered at UPSLIS this coming academic year 2022-2023. SLIS has also been very active online as it continues to offer Webinar Wednesdays or WebWed, a monthly webinar that started since July 2020 and throughout SLIS 60th anniversary. The WebWed series explores a variety of topics in the different areas of information studies and features experts from the Philippines and around the globe. Our other offerings in our YouTube channel are Coffee Break Reflections and Conversations, For the Record, Off the Record, Digital Scholarship, and Faculty Room. To the Stars, Ad Astra. And if I may add, Ad Astra per espera, to the stars through difficulties. Amidst the challenges and travails, we carried on, bringing the torch of light and hope that we all need in steering our way to subsist, persist, and progress. We thank all of you for constantly being present and incessantly contributing to the advancement of LS education in the Philippines. As we move forward into a new decade, we do not just gaze at the skies and wish. We shoot for the stars. Ad Astra. Thank you so much and happy 61st anniversary to the UP School of Library and Information Studies.
Maraming salamat po, Ma'am Rhea. Moving on, misinformation and disinformation are some of the biggest challenges of our generation. From the former US President Barack Obama to Nobel Prize winner Maria Ressa, many great leaders and scholars have been very vocal and critical about the harms that misinformation and disinformation can do to democratic societies. We in the field of librarianship and information studies are often using the lens of information literacy in engaging with misinformation and disinformation. But today, we're very fortunate to have one of the leading scholars studying disinformation to talk about another perspective that is very relevant for LS scholars and practitioners. Jonathan Corpus Ong is Associate Professor of Global Digital Media at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School Shorenstein Center. He is author of 2 books and over 25 journal articles in the areas of media ethics, digital politics, and the anthropology of humanitarianism. He is an engaged scholar with a long record of collaborating with human rights and humanitarian organizations, election integrity groups, and investigative journalists. Recently, he was named as one of the 28 Andrew Carnegie Fellows in 2022, representing the discipline of communication studies. His podcast, Catch Me If You Can, an election integrity intervention funded by Internews, is in the top 20 of the Philippines podcast charts. Everyone, we're very honored to have with us our guest this morning, Dr. Jonathan Corpus Ong.
Thank you, PJ. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you so much, UPSLIS, for having me. What an honor to be hosted by information studies and library scholars. So, I want to start by saying that disinformation researchers, social media platforms, journalists, we all need to be listening and in dialogue with library and information scholars. Much of the problems we identify with social media could be addressed by better curation of information and the vetting of sources and publishers. And that's what you folks do. My collaborators, including Joan Donovan at Harvard, have even asked what would Facebook look like if it hired 1,000 librarians to help them curate good information. So I'm really honored to be hosted by you all today. And I'm super happy to be here and to share with you my talk, which is entitled Disinformation Studies Without Determinism. I'll just be sharing my screen. Okay. So I hope you all can see that.
Yes,
Yes.
sir.
Great. Thank you so much. So this is a talk that argues for a more critical, collaborative, and non-technologically determinist kind of disinfo research in the Philippines. This talk will also make space for critical self reflection and asks, what exactly have we learned in the disinformation space over the past 6 years in the Philippines? What are the achievements of researchers and civil society in terms of holding disinformation producers accountable? And in light of the recent elections, how can we better understand the root causes of Filipino citizens' rejection of liberal democratic values and the personalities that represent them? How can we get to the root causes rather than knee jerk blaming of trolls or social media? So, as PJ said, I'm a communication and media scholar, and I want to clarify that in as much as media and comm scholars study media technologies as the central object of our research, we want to study technology in its broader social and cultural context. We assert also that ordinary people have agency. So we argue that political engagement, voting behaviors, trust in media institutions, these are shaped by digital media, by social media, but they're not determined from the top down. So this is what sets critical comm research apart from other disciplines or mainstream punditry. And I'm just sorry, I'll have to figure out what happened here. Let me just figure out what happened.
Yes, go ahead, sir.
Sorry. Okay, back. So we argue that ordinary people have critical rationalities and moral responsibility. Ordinary people make compromises and shift allegiances as well. They're influenced by political fandoms that reflect their values, and also they can be inspired by strategic narratives that are created and tested by other people who wish to exert power or also to gain more power. So, critical disinfo studies analyzes the exercise of power in our media environments. Yet, it goes beyond simple binaries of good versus evil, the good guys versus the bad actors. It should raise challenging questions about liberal institutions' own failures and complicities and make space in asking, what can we all do better? Right? So today I'll be outlining ways in which we can all work together and collaborate toward this more critical approach to disinfo studies. And please feel free to tweet at me at Jonathan_C_Ong. And feel free to check out the studies that are referenced in this talk in my link tree, as you can see below. So today's talk begins with outlining a vision for Pinoy disinfo in digital literacy studies. Second, I'd like to show examples and open questions for scholars in the critical library studies and information studies field about how they can help engage some of the questions and open unanswered questions in disinfo research. And third, I'll outline disinfo trends in 2022. So let me start with identifying some problematic tendencies of mainstream disinfo research and journalism. So in 2016, troll armies and fake news, these were new terms. They were new to our global lexicon, to our language. And many popular analysis of the 2016 elections of Trump, of Brexit, of course, Duterte, focused on social media's role in their surprise electoral victories. And we hope that the analysis of social media and politics has become more nuanced over the past 6 years. But some problematic positions continue to get amplified. And first is some will still continue to overstate social media as tools of technological brainwashing. And this is something that scholars like me try to argue against quite vehemently. So, this misleading analysis often takes on a fear mongering tone. So, in 2022, this past election cycle, the hype was all around TikTok, for example, right? And how it might have brainwashed teens, the BBM young supporters who did not grow up under martial law. Was it really TikTok at fault, or is TikTok being scapegoated here? So, this kind of analysis tends to be speculative and tends to be overreaching in terms of overplaying the behavioral or mind control effects of social media platforms. Often, it's assumed that the enemies of liberal democracy, whether the DDS or Trump supporters or Cambridge Analytica, somehow figured it out, right? So some of this analysis could just focus their analysis on the digital harms amplified by these bad actors without granting those bad actors and their tools a sense of invincibility or inevitability. And that undermines any idea of human agency that a critical approach should push against. Number two, and following from the first, some disinfo research takes on moral panics or a pearl clutching moralistic tone. And this is a refrain expressed by many Gen X academics and journalists, often toward unruly, uncivil people they encounter online. So this is often projected onto the masa, the bobotante, or the impressionable teens of TikTok. In this kind of analysis, to me, entrenches classism and ageism and only deepens existing political divides. So, moral panics over new media, a critical perspective will argue, are nothing new. And we need to think of cycles of previous moral panics, whether it be game shows of Willy Revillame, for example, or mobile phones, another scapegoated technology, and others, right? So we need to make sure that this info research is alert and alarmed, but not elitist as well. And I think there's certain kinds of analysis of this info that plays into the hands of our enemies if we reinforce those social divides, particularly when we conflate the Pinoy discourse about the trolls with the Pinoy discourse of the Bobotante. If those discourses are conflated, that plays into the hands of the enemy. Na grievance na nga nila yon, na the liberals are elitist, journalists talk down on them. So to me, I think we need to organize some of our narratives and our investigations such that it doesn't reinforce that divide. Third, let's talk about interventions. So over the past 6 years, the most popular solution, especially in global south countries such as the Philippines, is to invest more in fact-checking initiatives. Some of the choices here is the result of global funding structures. So social media platforms rely on local in-country fact checkers. They provide them, as modestly priced outsourced workers to help with some of their content moderation issues and content curation issues. For philanthropists and funders, this is also a model that is easily replicated from one country to the next. Academics like me are hugely supportive of fact checkers and how important a role they play in fighting disinfo. But moving forward, we also argue that what we need are also bottom up creative solutions that address local features of disinformation, of this local disinformation industries, right? Which is especially affecting many global South countries. So the argument here is we cannot simply fact check our way out of a profound crisis of distrust with liberal institutions and also broken business practices that need to be regulated better. So fact checking can do some um, only so much, and we need also bottom up creative solutions. Fourth, much of mainstream public discourse has been very slow in developing a nuanced understanding of trolls. So trolls is so much a part of Filipino popular discourse nowadays, but have we re-nuanced our understandings of who they are and where they come from. And to me, I think this has been very slow to evolve and kind of frustrating, to be honest. But this is, of course, shifting, right? And I think in the 2022 elections, there's more journalistic reporting and also talk shows that try to deconstruct campaigns, political campaigns, and their strategies. And I think that deeper deconstruction was not there before. But I think we need to nuance what we know and assume about trolls. Because if our understanding of the problem remains simplistic, then our solutions will also be simplistic or just wrong or even more dangerous. So, for one, fake news is folded into the anti-terror bill authored by approved by Duterte. And of course, we need to think of that initiative as a way to target leftist activists and media outlets and dissenters. However, it's not just Duterte, right? Opposition politicians too can author dangerous and overreaching laws. For example, laws that would focus on exposing identities of anonymous accounts, as seen in a provision of the SIM card registration bill advanced by opposition senators like Drilon and Pangilinan. So I think that is really problematic if they shoehorn provisions that might invade privacy. Also, journalists have exposed bloggers such as Mocha Uson as fake news queen. But I would argue that we need to talk about the people who are the real masterminds of political influence operations, not just the bloggers. However, we need to also think of how to exactly do that, how to name and shame the masterminds. For example, Nick Gabonada has been named in various news outlets for being the advertising executive responsible for the Duterte campaign. But we need to ask, has he suffered consequences? Right? What are the real consequences that should be imposed on people like him? um, we need to also ask journalists, how should we report on strategists like him? Because to be quoted by a BBC or an ABS-CBN might be seen as beneficial to their business. This could be a way for these people to seek clients and gain clients from each of these citations in news features. So, for example, in my work, I just try to anonymize rather than to name these people so that they don't gain more followers and more clients as a result. So we need to be asking these kinds of critical questions. For the last election cycle, we also saw the initiative around mass report hours. This was a practice by some digital volunteers of the Robredo campaign. However, social media platforms like Facebook has a policy against brigading, and that's our technical term for the inauthentic coordination of accounts that are there to report and target specific accounts, right? So, what can we do instead? What is, and here I present my vision and proposals for a more critical approach to disinformation in digital literacy studies in the Philippines. So, first, I would say we need a collaborative and interdisciplinary whole of society approach rather than gatekeeping cultures and siloed interventions. What does this mean? So, I think this initiative celebrates the different disciplinary expertise and talents of people. We need social sciences, engineers, and programmers working along with artists and storytellers. Investigative researchers need our work to be amplified and translated by journalists and also by artists, by visual artists, whose works can also be strategically curated by librarians and information scholars. Unfortunately, in the field, we see a lot of turf wars and citation politics, and I think we need to address those. Number two, rejecting the good versus evil, troll hunting, video game mindset might open up discussions of complicity, worker ethics, and the accountability of corporate elites. So, many people have this mentality that fighting trolls is about fighting bot accounts or reporting accounts with low followers. Na parang it becomes a kind of video game approach of troll busting, right? But I think we need these more challenging questions of complicity and expose the work infrastructures that uphold all of these practices. And what about when it comes to policy? So, number three, beyond lobbying for platform takedowns, academics and journalists should collaborate on strategic policy advocacy against overreaching, what people might call sibuyas legislation of both right and left politicians and other punitive approaches. So I think it's important to challenge these kinds of attempts to overregulate fake news as well, such that it might introduce more censorship or even normalize the use of libel as a way to fight fake news. I think that that approach introduces more harms rather than good. So, fourth, fighting disinfo isn't just about correcting lies, but designing persuasive stories, persuasive counter narratives that meaningfully address communities' fears and grievances. And this initiative should begin with an imperative and an openness to listen to communities, to immerse ourselves in the grassroots, and also invest in strategic communications. That will address communities' fears and offer them a compelling vision for a shared future. So, in my next slides, I'll be sharing some of my research and interventions that are examples would model some of the proposals I have made, and I hope folks could develop and advance in their own creative work. So the first is to conduct deep research about work hierarchies and profound questions about, and raise profound questions about ethics, responsibility, complicity in disinformation campaigns. And this is really the intention of our work, Architects of Network Disinformation, back in 2018. This is a project co-written with Jason Cabañas of De La Salle. And this is a report that is based on interviews with 20 political operators, but also the digital influencers below them, the fake account operators at the bottom of the hierarchy, and also the grassroots volunteers who work in campaigns. So this is a study that does not focus solely on disinformation as text or as a falsehood, but it's a study of disinformation as a collaborative work outcome, the end product of outsourced digital labor. So the thesis of architects is that nobody really calls themselves a troll. Trolls have fancy titles. They're PR associates, digital strategists, social media managers, or community moderators. And it's a study of how dirty work is normalized within creative industries, not apart from it, but within existing respectable creative industries. So this is as you can see on the screen, this is an infographic based on Architects of Network Disinfo. And the Tagalog translation, I would like to credit a volunteer, Gabe Caruncho, during the time of the elections. They volunteered to translate this infographic into Tagalog. And I would also like to invite folks to download this 2020 report, Politics and Profit in the Fake News Factory, published by NATO, and you can check that at the link tree below. Okay, next. So I had talked about the importance of collaborations. So between journalists and academics. So I think many of the work in the disinfo space is very siloed, and that journalists will do their fact checks and investigations, but they would rarely build on the knowledge that academics have produced. And for us academics, we're so busy writing journal articles and doing all the things, checking papers and stuff, and we fail to properly strategize on media outreach. We fail to strategize on how to translate our work to a broader audience. And so I see Catch Me If You Can, this podcast produced by Puma Podcast. as a true collaboration between myself and investigative journalist Kat Ventura. Our episodes involve interviews with trolls and also higher level political operators, and you hear their voices directly. In episode 1, we interviewed Danny, not his real name. And I like to play a snippet from episode 1 when he reflects on what made him feel guilty about the experience of working for a political PR campaign during elections. And Danny's story is that of a fresh grad whose first job out of college was in a PR firm. And he initially thought he would handle a corporate client only to find out that they would do PR for the election campaign of a mayoral candidate. So let's listen to how he processes the dilemma and how he justifies himself.
I saw my professor, I saw my college instructor for Instagram journalist to this very day. Tama siya ng one-on-one interview with my wala lang yun. And then nagulat siya na, oh, nandito ka. Sabi niya, hindi po. Eh, ano ka na pala nag-work? Sabi ko, oh, sir, ganyan. O, kamusta ka naman? Parang chilling, effective. Kasi nakita mo yung tao na tumulong sa'yo at graduate ka ng 4 years of college. And then makikita niya, nandito ka. You're doing the exact same thing that your teachers told you not to do. My college professor, I saw him, deadly eye, looking at me, he was really, oh, he was so disappointed with one of his students. And fresh grad ako noon, so impossible hindi nakakaroon. Kasi kakagraduate ko lang eh. So, medyo fresh pa kami students sa Memoria. Tapos, sabi ko sa sarili ko, parang, what are we doing with my life?
So, Kat and I are very proud. This podcast made it to top 6 of the Filipino podcast charts in the month of May. And we've produced season 1, which is only 3 episodes, but we're busy researching and putting things together for season 2. And for those of you who might have ideas and tips for season 2, or who also want to be interviewed by us, please drop me a line. So, another story of this podcast is that it's important for us that we situate troll confessions in their proper context. I think many of us were swept up by the excitement of some troll confessions after the May elections, but we need to situate them into proper context and not to take what they say at face value as well. And I think that's why it's important to ground some of these in broader research and deeper research. So I'll just briefly mention here strategic policy advocacy. I think now scholars need to participate in legislative hearings and work with local legal experts to advise around fake news laws. And of course, there's real risk here, of course. The chair of the Senate Electoral Reforms Committee in the last a couple of years was Amy Marcos. And I think increasingly academics have to practice some strategy, not so much caution, but strategy when it comes to policy advocacy. I've also collaborated with Nicole Corato in initiating deliberative forums where we talk to ordinary people and listen to them how they understand fake news and how they encounter fake news in their own words. So now I'll just quickly move on to part 2 of my talk, which is to pose unanswered questions and ask what can library and information scholars can contribute to unanswered questions in this info research. And my proposal is for us to collaborate on ethnographic studies on how ordinary Filipinos might use social media for political information seeking. I think on one hand, studies of social media use have employed survey methodologies, but that kind of approach don't really get into why people trust or choose certain platforms over others and how they use Google search, for example, to get into their rabbit holes. So I think that's something that info scholars can contribute. I also think of, studies of my colleagues such as Nicole Corato, Arguelles, Ash Presto, who have deepened our understanding of why populist publics support Duterte, or how they support Marcos, for example, right? Um, However, social media and information seeking practices is not central to that kind of research. And I think there's a space here, there's a gap here where that kind of sociological research on populist publics could be complemented by an approach that examines how they do information seeking practices online. So, another suggestion is for live and info scholars to study the media manipulation technique of keyword squatting. And my colleagues at Harvard define keyword squatting as the media manipulation technique of creating online content around a specific search engine optimized term so as to determine the search results of that term. In that way, they're able to fill information voids. You know, parang if there's a search term that many people are really interested in, but there's a lack of information, that's where media manipulators can jump in. So for me, it's important to explore keyword squatting when thinking about how social media has been used as a repository of Marcos myths and folklore over the years. So I'll just show you an example of how this might look like. If you get on Google search, I type in Marcos gold bars and I examine on Google search the results of that topic and the page rank of that topic. So we quickly learn that this keyword in Google search will lead us to many alternative news pages and influencers. So here on Google, on my Google search, and your search might turn out different results. For me, it shows Inquirer as the first item, so legitimate news outlet. Then it links us to Wikipedia. Immediately links us to Wikipedia and folklore about the Yamashita treasure. So we're getting into folklore territory. I would like to ask Live and Info scholars, do you consider Wikipedia as a reliable and trustworthy page? Or do people, might people see it as a site that might also peddle misinformation? Also, we might ask, what is the line between folklore and misinformation? So after Wikipedia, links 2 to 5 on Google. Links 2 to 5 are already split between mainstream media pages like Press One and ABS-CBN, and then YouTube channels. The Marcos Gold bars are real. I have seen them. And then another says, I have seen the Marcos Gold bars in November 2005. And I um, um annotated it with a biohazard icon. So links 6 to 9 have Rappler pages sandwiched by YouTube channels and Facebook groups. If you click those pages, we're brought to pages that would blur the line between folklore, misinfo, and Marcos fan pages. YouTube page, Wealth for Humanity, FM Gold, FM Ferdinand Marcos, right? So that's an example of processes we can study together of certain keywords that on Google pa lang na i-influence na agad yung stories. All right, so I can see we're almost at time. So I'll end with I think 2 slides that will just summarize some disinfo trends in 2022, and I'll just introduce the key highlights for us to expand on during question time. So for me, the first trend of note in 2022 is the mainstreaming of the alternative. What were once fringe bloggers, influencers, and strategists have now achieved formal legitimacy and found new media platforms that will be hospitable to them. What we have in 2022 is a media and information ecosystem with more diverse options than 2016. There's news channels, newspapers, tabloids that lend more legitimacy to perspectives once expressed only on Twitter or the Mocha Uson blog. Second, polarized epistemologies. Academic experts, pundits, pollsters, consultants offer political fandoms their brand of partisan expertise. They also participate in influencer cultures of clout chasing, and they seek political patrons. So here, I would like to reference colleague July T. Hanky. He uses the term the multiverse of madness to talk about the Filipino political environment of 2022. In that political camps live in their own universes, and I would just like to stress that knowledge production and knowledge producers and media producers are central part of these multiverse. Kakampinks can now choose to ignore Pulse Asia surveys for Google Trends, as some influencers of theirs would affirm, just as BBM and Duterte factions might distrust Rappler. Intellectuals play into partisanship and provide legitimacy to sometimes fringe perspectives. And that's important for us to think about. And finally, the third main trend is there's diversification of digital content with historical distortions. So I just want to say that historical revisionism is not new. It has found diverse platforms and expressions across those platforms. But I also want to emphasize that at the core of the many kinds of historical revisionist narratives and distortion narratives is the same underlying deep story. And that deep story is the Marcos family. They are victims, so called victims of liberal elites, journalists, and historians. And that deep story is consistent. It's also strategic. It's how they perform their own relatability to the disenfranchised. Biktima din kami. Just like you, I can identify with you. So that consistency is important to affirm in light of talking about the diversity and newness of some of the historical distortion expressions that we see online. So finally, this is my last slide. I would like to say that liberals cannot take for granted that publics should trust us in our institutions. They should also not end with scapegoat analyses that social media or trolls are all to blame. We need to make a case why they should trust us. We need to make a compelling and persuasive argument as well. Number two, transparency and accountability aim for independent audit mechanisms of social media platforms in the business of political consulting and political PR. While challenging to implement, this poses less risk than top-down legislation that can clamp down on dissent. So after the elections, ang dami kong nakitang tweets na dapat merong batas against fake news. That's easier said than done, really. And I think top-down legislation is something that might introduce more harm than good, especially if it's a bad faith legislator behind it. So what I'm pushing for is independent audit mechanisms. You know, people who are independent academic, civil society experts to have a look at social media platforms, what they're seeing, also to overlook the business of campaigns, to have a check on Comelec as well. You know, so that's what independent audit mechanisms might look like. Finally, academics need to collaborate. We need to move out of our silos, out of our disciplines, to collaborate with activists, journalists, and community organizers for strategic outreach. So, finally, I just want to plug this newly published short collection of essays. Here, Trolls for Sale is my short collection of essays, along with other titles by Ishmael Bernal, Nefertita Diar, Patrick Flores, and Rolando Tino. And you can check that out on my link tree as well. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Wow. Maraming salamat, Sir Jonathan Ong. We actually have more than 400 viewers now, both in our Facebook and YouTube video, and we've received a lot of a lot of questions that we're going to tackle in a short while. So before we proceed, for those who just tuned in, again, welcome. This is our UPSLS webinar series organized by the UP School of Library and Information Studies. To our audience, if you have any questions for our speaker, please go to slido.com and type in the code TROLL. That's TROLL. You can also use the QR code shown on screen to go to our questions page. Please check the previously asked questions and you can upvote them if you have the same questions. Some announcement before we proceed. Thank you to those who already purchased our SLIS coffee table book. Proceeds from sales will go towards the SLIS Building Fund. For those of you who have no copies yet, you can now pre-order for our next print run by going to bit.ly/SLISCTB. The link is also the one that you can see on your screen. Also, the Kaagapay project for UP BLIS students of the UP Library Science Alumni Association, or the UP LSAA, is still ongoing. We want to ensure that every BLIS student is equipped with the required tools or gadgets for remote learning. So the Kaagapay project is in support of the program of the UP system, Kaagapay sa Pag-aaral ng mga Scholar ng Bayan. You may donate in cash or in kind to help our BLIS students who may be struggling with remote learning. You may send your inquiries to upslaa.inc@gmail.com. And finally, the UP-SLIS is still accepting donations for the construction and renovation of our new SLIS building. Here's your opportunity to contribute to UP-SLIS and LIS education in the country. For your donations or other inquiries, you may contact us via email at admin@slis.upd.edu.ph. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow our Twitch TV, and our UPSLIS channel on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch. And we would like to greet those who are watching us right now, people from UNP, SLU, University of Makati, LGU of Davao del Sur, Laguna, San Jose Occidental, Mindoro, people from the Bantayog ng mga Bayani, hello po, and those from UP Clark, and we also have people watching overseas. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Okay, um, Sir Jonathan, medyo mahaba-habang usapan to, no? We have actually a lot of questions here, and some of the questions that we're going to address first would be, I think this is from your colleague. There's a question here sent by Kael, Mr. Nimagi. Hi daw, Sir John. The question is, let me read it. While I wholeheartedly agree with it, the whole of society or whole of nation lens necessarily requires the buy-in of government. Paano kung hindi maka-ascribe ng good faith sa government and in fact can reasonably expect them to resist, counter disinfo efforts dahil nagbe-benefit sila sa disinfo? How can we get the buy-in from the government? Sir
Mm-mm.
Jonathan?
Yeah. Mhm. That's a great question. How can we get the buy-in of government, and also how can we also maintain independence for civil society actors, academics? Is that enough? That kind of independence as well. So, um, I would I would see government actors as important, but not we shouldn't see ourselves as fully dependent on them, and on any top-down efforts. I think there's many creative and bottom-up approaches that many civil society actors can pursue on their own terms, right? So when we think about strategic communications and messaging, how to let's focus on the problem of, for example, human rights rebranding and how to rebuild trust on human rights values and human rights organizations. So that is something that will not require, like top-down support of government institutions. Um, fully, some of these organizations can invest more at the organizational level also work across their own agency with other agencies as well. You would like to see them working in a smoother environment that would be more hospitable to them, right? At that level, there's ways in which they can build communications, adopt creative strategies, learn from others who are doing really creative work as well, without any kind of top-down support and effort. So there's some of those that we can develop and innovate. I do agree with you that there's huge constraints if the government is the biggest bad actor. And I think the Philippines is not unique in this space as well. So there's other countries. We might only look to those countries with existing anti-fake news laws that are really clamping down on activists, that are even clamping down on opposition politicians and their opposition parties. um, yeah, that would be the worst kind of example and what we should prevent, So, um, I think to the extent that we can engage legislators to employ some of these more independent audit mechanisms rather than to fully agree with any kind of overreaching legislation. So once they introduce like a moral panics frame, in aid of legislation, that's when my alert, my spidey sense gets activated as well. That's usually something that I would push back against.
Salamat po, Sir Ong. The questions are now pouring in, and I hope we can address some of them, but I'm not sure if we can address all of the questions. I believe Sir Jonathan posted his social media links, and I'm sure he'd be happy if you can follow some of the links that he already posted. Sir, merong question dito. This is another question from someone who identified as Muhammad Rehan Rashid. Hi, I am a PhD research fellow at UMass Amherst. Sir, the most challenging task is to spot disinformation in audio or video. Can you suggest any methods to analytically examine content? Secondly, the social media content moderation is not catering to the regional realities and values. So, what are your thoughts about this?
Mhm. Yeah, I think Muhammad points out something. Hi, Muhammad. I don't know you at UMass. Feel free to drop me a line though. So I agree that disinfo in the form of text and falsehoods in the form of text is easier to fact check and to monitor rather than video or audio kinds of misinfo and disinfo, right? So um, I myself study YouTube conspiracy theories, and my strategy here is not through purely computational methods, but to actually immerse in the vocabulary, immerse in the inside jokes of these influencers. So once they post like certain keywords or phrases, also when they guest a fellow influencer on their channel, I make sure to follow that other person's page, right? And you need to first understand the inside jokes, the subcultures of specific communities, whether they're supporters of a particular politician or if they're believers of a particular kind of conspiracy theory around anti vaccine, for example. You need to treat them as lively and creative cultures with their own specific folklore and inside jokes. Try to dig up some of the links that they're also posting. So see it as a kind of immersive experience, to see text, video claims, knowledge claims as all working as part of an information ecosystem. So there's some computational scholars who are able to more systematically map out networks at greater scale. My focus is more the cultural dimensions of how and why people share the things that they do, and ultimately what are their hidden intentions, right? So sometimes those intentions are not present, like in the if you watch the first video, but it's only hours and hours in immersing oneself in a particular YouTube page, that you get to know, oh, this is a particular genre that's appealing to certain groups. So I just wanted to share the example of YouTube reaction videos as one genre that I observed was very, very popular in the past election cycle in the Philippines. So these are local vloggers on YouTube that play Marcos speeches and then just comment on them. Sometimes they'll also, there's a phenomenon of these vloggers na foreigners sila, na they're actually a fam. 'Di ba, na parang they're in another country but they're commenting on Marcos and Philippine politics for the views and for the clicks, not so much obviously for any kind of ability to, yeah, to express to actually vote for Marcos, but it's more for the monetization potential of, yeah, of seeing Filipino political fandom as something that generates so much clicks and revenue for them through the YouTube algorithm.
Salamat, Sir Jonathan. Yeah, I remember those videos. Some of those reaction videos started with Charis videos or performances from Pinoy Got Talent, those shows.
Yes.
And then now they're reacting to Philippine election. No, it's very,
Exactly. So their genre is starts with like music, diba? And then
yeah.
pivots to politics.
Yeah, so it really requires a lot of time. Now you really have to study the subculture to identify the images and the videos, and that's the way to tackle those. Thank you, Sir Jonathan. There's another question here that was sent from someone who identified as Kent Saga. So the question is, thank you, Professor. Similar media and pseudo media strategies have been implemented in other countries, but have not been effective. What can you say that is the quality of education in the Philippines, which makes our countrymen more vulnerable to disinfo strategies? Do you think it's something in our education
Mm-mm.
system?
Yeah, I think there's culture plays a huge part in it. Filipino cultures of folklore and chismis. 'Di ba, parang we need to think about misinformation as part of our practices of, you know, rumor during crisis events as well. Previously, before I studied this info, I studied crisis communication during Yolanda, and rumors is one phenomenon of, you know, like how Filipinos experience crisis. We need explanatory devices to make sense of events that are hard to make sense of and have a sense of control over. So we need to think of misinfo, disinfo in its broader history as well. And certainly a Filipino culture of, you know, gossip, rumor is so much a part of that. Um, Educational system in its failings, that's a really touchy subject, to be honest, and quite challenging to talk about. I do think that our school teachers need more support, more resources, more investment. And it's unfair to just blame the system or blame teachers. Na parang there's a way of, you know, that this kind of expression comes up na ano ba yung tinuturo sa mga bata nowadays in our schools, in our public schools. And sometimes there's a blaming, you know, the public schools as well, that strikes me as sometimes a bit classist in its expressions. So I don't go to that extent. Certainly we need to also have that uncomfortable discussion of, you know, history teachers in certain regions would choose to also, they are invested in a counter history as well, that they're actually going off the history books to argue against what is said in the history books. So that is something that I hear colleagues. I remember having that discussion with a colleague, JC Punong Bayan. He mentioned having those discussions with history teachers, high school history teachers from certain regions in the country that might be sympathetic to certain politicians na medyo iba yung pananaw nila sa pagtuturo ng history. So that's an uncomfortable conversation that we should be having, right? So I think that needs to be nuanced as well na hindi lang yung ano na nga ba yung tinuturo sa public schools ngayon. I think that's unfair to our teachers as well.
Thank you. Yes, that's also another long discussion that we really have to delve into. Sir, I'm going to lump a lot of questions here because it seems like many of the questions are about how can we regulate, no, how can we regulate the PR firms that you mentioned as
Mm.
part of the disinformation
Mm.
architecture, let me
Yeah.
just highlight one of the questions here. Sorry, yeah, please bear with me because there are really a lot of questions pouring in right now, and a lot of our audience are very interested with the work that you do. For example, do you think the free access to Facebook here in the Philippines contribute to the trolls proliferating here in our country? And then also, how can we, how can we
Mm.
regulate the PR firms?
Mm. Yeah. So, how to regulate PR firms? I think this is a challenging question that um many academics, such as myself, have collaborated with local civil society experts. I would like to cite Lente, a local election watchdog in the Philippines, who also have very strong links with Comelec. And what Lente tried to do was to bring together different advertising agencies and PR firms and to have them sign a collective code of ethics around political campaigns that they will try to uphold political campaigns that are going to be trustworthy and that will not peddle misinformation. So a code of ethics, which is to be signed by private entities and PR firms. Um, a code of ethics which doesn't have real teeth or consequences, but just an affirmation that we're here to do fair and honest political campaigns. And unfortunately, Lente and myself, who tried to support them, we encountered a lot of resistance from PR firms in these attempts at self-regulation. And I think we need to be seeing how PR firms see attempts at regulation as hitting them at their bottom line. It might have an impact on their abilities to earn income, any kind of transparency mechanism, diba? But I think we shouldn't, even though this initiative honestly failed. Frankly, it failed and did not get the buy-in of PR firms, even though it was not gonna, post any financial penalties on them, but they're just afraid to do it or just not interested or think that they're above the law as well, right? So we need to also think of how PR firms and some political consultants are protected by politicians. PR firms and political consultants helped elect politicians into power after all. So there's an utang na loob dimension here. That's why in many of our hearings, Senate investigations, it's always the bloggers, the vloggers, the influencers who are always named and shamed, but never the top dogs, never the masterminds. So, what are ways in which we need to do this? I think whistleblowers are so important here. And I think we need to get younger people in who are working in advertising agencies, in PR firms, and they see their companies as actually supporting certain politicians and doing things in very shady ways, doing attack memes, doing disinformation campaigns in house. They need to speak up more, and we need to find them ways and spaces to protect them as whistleblowers, like ways to protect whistleblowers. I think that will be an important way to shed more light in these industries. And again, it's very challenging, and we need to be authoring things, from creating things from scratch. So wala tayong model or template, na there's something in the US that has been done and therefore it's easy to copy or paste. There are whistleblower initiatives in other countries, such as in Nigeria, and South Africa to empower a more transparency in social media. Na parang there needs to be more transparency in the supply chain when social media platforms work with local, content moderators. And I think those kinds of ways in which we shed more light and create more transparency in the practices and the business of campaigns, that's where we need more momentum around and more collaboration around. Yes.
Thank you, Sir Jonathan. Okay, so another question here. Maybe we can entertain two more questions. Because there's really so many questions right now. Pero sige, I think we still have time for three. Okay lang ba yun, Sir Jonathan?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yeah.
so there's a question here. Um, Eto, hi. This question was sent by Gio Marie. Hello po. Would it be better if government will help in regulating contents being uploaded on the internet? Kasi Google is
No.
personalizing the searches based on the behavior of the users. I think you've already
Mm-mm.
mentioned something about the
Mm-mm.
government regulating the platforms.
Absolutely. So, when government tries to overreach in terms of the control of content, that's dun tayo dapat matakot. And countries like Singapore have these kinds of anti-fake news laws. And yeah, scholars such as Cherry and George have said that they use moral panics of fake news to justify these kind of overreaching laws. And that's the worst case scenario, really, because that will introduce censorship. Yeah. Mhm.
Thank you. There's an interesting question here. What would be your suggestions, no, in promoting digital literacy for the older generations?
That's so important. Yeah. Misinformation and disinformation as amplified by the older generation. So, because often we always again tend to blame younger people, the TikTok teens who did not grow up in martial law. Sila yung palagi nating sila yung nabiblame palagi. They're the ones on social media. But as we have realized during the time of COVID, a lot of COVID misinfo was amplified by many of our titos and titas and our mommies and our lolos and lolas, 'di ba? Kung ano-anong mga folk cures, for example, the different kind of close groups as well, yung mga neighborhood groups, mga alumni groups. Yun yung totoong cesspool of misinfo and disinfo, right? So, what needs to happen as well is if we're thinking of ways to translate our research to younger people, right? There needs to be a translation of research and investigations addressed to older people as well. So I think for some older people, studies about closed groups and chat groups, I think that is a more relevant case study that addresses them. Just as we saw, like dozens of articles about TikTok teens over the past couple of months, there should be dozens and dozens of studies as well looking at those close groups, alumni Facebook groups as real cesspools of misinfo and try to do tailor fit kind of communications to them, and some of them, number two, some of these conversations have to happen offline as well. How to talk to your radicalized lolo or lola. I have colleagues here in the US. Ito yung problema nila, how to talk to a radicalized lolo or lola na Trump supporter. So, my PhilAm colleagues, ito yung problema nila. So, it's not a digital strategy, but a conversation guide. So, and we have some examples na itong kind of way of having a chat with your lolo or lola, kailangan may third person in the room, meron parang mediator. So parang you assign a friend or another relative, siya yung mediator na parang not there to take any side. Parang yung role nila is calm down, pampa-tone down nung intensity nung conversation. So you're there to assert your side, to present your facts, obviously your lolo or lola might present their own version of reality. The third person is there to still affirm your social bonds. Um, so I think that's a different way of addressing the problem of misinfo na not purely online yung strategy, but it's also a conversation that needs to happen offline.
Wow, I think that's a strategy that I can also use myself. Thank you, Sir Jonathan. I remember there were studies in the US na the time spent during especially Thanksgiving dinner becomes shorter and shorter because it's really becoming difficult to talk to elder people because of social media and the belief. So thank you for those strategies. I think they are really really helpful. Um, another question here, Sir Jonathan. Again, there are really a lot of questions. If you can see the questions that we have here. This one is sent by Conception Joey. So the question is, this one goes back again to education. So, Prof. Jonathan, do you think disenfranchising
Mm.
will be more effective than educating, and would fake news on fake news would be more effective in the long game? Do you think counteracting fake news with fake news is effective?
No, I don't think we should use the tools of our enemies. We um, parang we run the risk of becoming the monsters that we're trying to fight against. If we adopt their same tools and strategies. At the same time, there are so not to fight trolls with other trolls, not to fight fake news with other fake news, diba? Parang that's not tenable moving forward. That actually makes the information ecosystem much more broken, and yeah, that only introduces more pollution to an already polluted information environment. At the same time, there are ways in which we can work and collaborate better. So, if you study right wing groups and right wing actors here in the United States, we can apply the same perspective when studying, BBM supporters and their influencers. PJ, you had mentioned YouTube vloggers. What do? They help amplify and share each other's work. 'Di ba, na parang kung nakikita mong nag-guest ng yung influencer nung kapwa nilang influencer na pro Marcos, 'di ba parang they help amplify each other's work. So I see na parang among progressives, among liberal groups, parang we tend to be more competitive with each other. Yeah, to be honest, right? So some of that kind of strategic coordination is not there. And then number two, to be so attuned to the public's grievances and fears and anxieties and address them head on, to have either a solution to it or to just to plain acknowledge it, is something that the right wing groups do so well in many different contexts. Diba? And I think that's what we see parang with Duterte, with Marcos, this feeling of victimhood. Diba? The sense of victimhood, the sense of shame, and parang we can see that feeling, parang we amplify, we share that same grievance with you. So some of those issues and ways of communicating that, rather than talking down on communities, but really being with and immersing with communities, sharing their same vocabularies, that's so important, to use the same words and references and pop culture references that they do as a way to connect with groups. So I think that's something that we should be doing more of. Going down to the grassroots is something so important, and we need to be doing that. We need to have done that much sooner as well than the last few months of a campaign. So I think those are just some of the stuff that we can think of doing more of moving forward. But great question.
Thank you. Now, a lot of the questions earlier are really about combating disinformation, but now let's focus on doing research about it. So, there's a question sent by someone who I believe is interested about the data that you have. So, the question is: you mentioned that there's a need for collaboration between different disciplines. Are the data set of your research available for verification, and is it usable to other researchers to be their starting point for their own research endeavor?
Mm-hmm. Um, so that is something that so to make our research open access is something that many disinfo scholars have done. And Architects of Network Disinformation came out as an open access report back in 2018. And so you can have a deep dive into those stories. And yeah, and really immerse yourself to it. So there's so much momentum that was so um, yeah, like gave me so much energy over the past couple of months, the deeper interest in the subject of this info, of troll industries, of not just, surface level analysis, but really nuanced and in-depth analysis. And I really, really welcome that. So, um, for any budding and interested young researcher on the topic, really have a deep dive on previous studies on the topic. You don't need to come up with a whole new system or invent a whole new system of doing research on this info or trolls, right? Like some of these examples are already present, and we welcome it. Like if you build upon them, right? And I think that's something that the reason why we make our research open access is something, yeah, that's one of the reasons why we do it. Having said that, and that's why I'm also so thrilled to be here with library and information scholars, um, seeing all the public reaction of our research, and also the our myself and my colleagues inability to cope with that demand and interest, we realized na parang there was a problem of curation as well, na parang we should have, collected all of our studies, put them on a proper website, had Tagalog translations of each one of them, shorter versions of each 80-page report, for public consumption. Yeah, maybe had like shorter videos as well of each report. And I think that's something that we're hoping to do moving forward. So moving forward, what myself and colleague Nicole Corato wants to do is to have an open access course, an open access course that will teach how to do this info research, that will also make studies available for the public, and will also invite the public to do their own investigations around certain issues or keywords. So this is something that we want to do over the next 6 months, 7 months. So please stay tuned for that. But we are really hoping to work with graphic designers for those who are skilled with doing infographics, for example. That is such an important skill that, PJ and myself, like we're not the best people to do those infographics, right? Um, Also, short video translations of our research is so important as well. So, kung meron kayong mga TikTok or influencer kayo, we need you as researchers, right? To help translate our work in ways that the public will engage with and understand. So, it's yeah, so there's so many opportunities to collaborate in the strategic outreach part, and also in doing your own deep dives and investigation. And our reports are, yeah, available for free download in the link tree that I had sent earlier.
Maraming salamat to all our students who's watching right now. Sobrang dami ng research topic ang na-bring up ni Sir Jonathan. And we're all looking forward to that Disinfo research training. Hopefully, matuloy yan. Maraming salamat. Siguro, this one last question is
Okay.
something that can be addressed. Though. There's an individual here that asks, as a private entity, individual or corporation, what is the most efficient use of funds when it comes to solving this problem? Ano po yung marirecommend niyo, sir?
So as a private entity, I think yeah, I speak also in behalf of UPSLIS. Work with academics, and we would love to help you. In terms of advising you how to make best use of your resources. You might have capacities for, computational analysis. You might have capacities to put pressure on the politicians. You might have policy advocacy expertise. We need all of those in this particular space. So this info cannot be solved by one tool or technology. That's also something that I emphasize so much, particularly from private engineers and engineering kind of entities. I'm trying to develop a website that would solve this info, or a tool that will um, uh, solve the crisis. So those kinds of tools oriented mindset is something that I would push back against. But you really situate your kind of approach in terms of particular values and values of really understanding the complexity of the problem rather than offer tech solutions to the issue. So I think the problem of this info is a, partly a problem of tech, and it's not also tech that will solve this issue. So what we need here is really a profound rethinking, reorganizing of different democratic institutions and the way we do things. That includes academia, and how we also need to be humble and work with many different collaborators to have real impact in the kind of work that we do. Yeah, but we
Very well
welcome
said.
your interest and enthusiasm, whoever you are.
Yes, and I know there are some questions that we haven't addressed. So please send. We can interact with you via the comment section in the Facebook video that will be posted, and also on the YouTube video. And also you can interact with the links that will be posted by UPSLS and by Professor Jonathan Ong. Sir, maraming salamat for answering all our viewers' questions. Before we end our webinar, do you have, I know you have a lot of things to promote, so please go ahead.
Yeah, so just to say that my new anthology, Trolls for Sale, is available for the very accessible price of 220 pesos, published by a local publisher, thanks to Katrina Stewart Santiago, and it's available at Lazada. So you can check it out on my link tree, along with other research that is free for everybody to download. Linktree/John C. Ong.
Maraming salamat. Do you also have upcoming
Mhm.
talks, Sir Jonathan?
Yes, so I have an upcoming talk on, I believe, Friday morning, Manila time, with the Journalism Studies Association of the Philippines.
Ayun. Maraming salamat. To all our viewers, we'll be posting the link tree by Sir Jonathan on our on the video so that you can access the book and also the other research mentioned throughout the talk. Maraming salamat po, Sir Jonathan.
Thank you so much for having me, PJ, and your faculty. It's an honor.
Okay. Again, to all our viewers, thank you so much for joining us. And we hope that you all had a great learning experience from this webinar. Thank you also to our SLIS faculty for making this event possible. Special shout out to our hardworking and ever reliable tech team, Professor Nathan Isep and Professor Mark Santos and Professor Dan Dorado for managing the tech side of this event. To Professor Johan Frederick Cabab and Mr. Dij Paul Reyes for their work on the graphics and publicity materials. Maraming salamat po. To give feedback and to request a certificate, please don't forget to register using the link shown on the screen. This link will only be active for a month, so please make sure to fill out the form before it expires. You can also leave an evaluation at any time. If you miss portions of this webinar, you may rewatch it as a Facebook video or check our YouTube channel. For updates on upcoming activities, please follow us at our official Facebook page, UPSLIS. Subscribe to our YouTube and Twitch channels youtube.com/UPSLIS, and twitch.tv/UPSLIS, or visit our website, upslis.info. You can also catch our online talk shows on YouTube for the record, Faculty Room, and the student-produced Digital Scholarship Lecture Series, Coffee Break, Reflections, and Conversations, and Off the Record, a student-led spin-off of our For the Record series that discusses concepts in archives and records management. Ayan, so kita-kits ulit tayo sa ating next webinar Wednesday in August. So that wraps up our webinar Wednesday for July. Maraming salamat po once again. This is Paul Jason Perez, your host and moderator, signing off. Paalam.